My name is Terry Spurlock, and this is a talk entitled Use of Aerial Imagery to Visualize Fungicide Efficacy on Soybean. So in 2021, 2020, continuing in 2022, incidentally, we have a project funded by the Arkansas Soybean Promotion Board to do on-farm fungicide trials. And so we do trials all over the state with cooperators, working with the local county agent there. And there's a couple of objectives here, but for the most part and for our purposes today, we're really just talking about one objective, how efficacious these fungicides may be on a number of different diseases. So we spread these trials out all over the state to try to get a lot of different varieties involved, a lot of different disease pressures, and hopefully realize some efficacy data on many different diseases that we might encounter. It's a little bit like hedging your bets rather than have, you know, a trial at a station where you may not or may not get disease. We move around the state. Something else about these trials is they're large trials. So we have individual blocks, large block trials that are replicated. The blocks may be like as big as 5-6 acres. The whole trial might be as small as 15 acres, or actually as large as, say, like 60 acres. I think we had one that was almost 60 acres in 2020. And so we're spraying these large strips, 30 something rows wide, depending on the row spacing, with a ground rig at 10 gallons of water per acre. We always have a standard fungicide treatment. This happens to be Mirabis Top at 13.7 fluid ounces per acre. That is an SDHI and a triazole pre-mixed product. We always have non-treated controls, and then we normally put in at least one other fungicide. For the most part, it's been Revitec at 7 or 8 ounces, product from BASF. But anyway, sometimes we have more than that. And then we apply all this at R3. We evaluate disease at R6. We collect yield data with either a weigh wagon or with the farmer's combine. Prefer the combine and the yield data off that because it's a little more flexible on how we can analyze it. But for the most part, we've gotten yield data on almost every trial that we've put out. So that's been very good. Our cooperators are really good in that respect, allowing us to get that yield data. And we've seen some real differences in efficacy in these products. And then we also fly a drone at R3 at the time of application because I want to get a look at the field from above to understand, was there any variability there when we actually applied the product? And then again at R6 so that we can see maybe if we've got some differences in disease development, we might be able to see that in the drone imagery. So we'll talk about that at the end of the talk. But I want to start with talking about some of the results here that we've had and just kind of walk through typical fungicide data. This is in 2020. You can see columns here with the application date. So we started applying product at June 16th of 2020, and we made our last application on some wheat beans in Ashley County on August 10th. And typically we were shooting for R3. We didn't always hit it. Sometimes it was, you might say 2.5, but we went ahead and got her sprayed. And then, you know, sometimes we're a little bit late because of weather or other things. But then we did evaluations on these dates here when they were at R6. And the trend here, there's a lot to look at, but the general trend is what we're interested in. The trend is about when did we see differences in the fungicide treatment strips, regardless of fungicide. In this case, we're just talking about fungicide versus no fungicide, the non-treated controls. When did we see the most often that difference, that yield difference? And it was always, like in 2020, in 2020 and 2021, it was almost always in our later applied beans. So those beans that were maturing in the later part of the season, we see here where we applied July 23rd in Ashley County, we had a 12 bushel difference where there was some aerial blight, Cercospora leaf blight 1.8, 4.4. But this one up here was kind of the outlier. We really didn't see any differences until we got late in the season, but we had almost a 9 bushel difference where we had severe Septoria brown spot in 2020 in the Lonoke County trial. So in 2021, same everything, essentially same presentation here, different locations, but the trend was the same. I guess we had this Septoria brown spot early in the season where we had a lot of Septoria here in this trial in Arkansas County, about a 5 bushel difference. And then later in the season, we started having every single trial that we applied later that was maturing later have differences in yield when compared to the untreated control. But in both years, we had these earlier maturing and not necessarily early, but earlier maturing soybean fields where we had this severe Septoria brown spot, and we saw differences in yield where we applied fungicide versus where we didn't. And this is what Septoria brown spot looks like when it's severe. And I think a lot of times we might, as consultants, pathologists, farmers, anyone walking through looking at these fields trying to understand what's going on, we might think that this is simply maturity. It's not. It's actually disease. These fields are what we would say cutting out early. And so this Septoria brown spot was severe. It was all the way in this particular field. It was all the way to the top of the canopy, and it was all the way to the top of the canopy before I rated it at R6, but I did the final rating at R6. And so I think here, this is what severe yield limiting Septoria brown spot looks like. This is the 2020 data from 3 trials where we had Miravis top, Revitec at 8 ounces, and a non-treated control replicated. So in Chico County, this is very far south Arkansas, far southeast corner of the state. There's it's right outside of Eudora, just to the west of Eudora. We had a little bit of Septoria brown spot in the non-treated control, about 50% incidence, 18% severity, and that's really not necessarily meaningful numbers, only just to compare to the other treatments, right? So 2% and 7% in severity. There wasn't a significant difference in yield here. On a trial there on the Lincoln County, Jefferson County line, just south of Pine Bluff, kind of the same thing. Certainly there was more Septoria where we didn't apply either of these fungicides, but both fungicides did a pretty good job controlling the disease and protecting some yield. We didn't see any differences there. But in Lonoke County, this is that early trial in 2020. There was quite a high incidence and severity of Septoria brown spot. And again, there was a 9 bushel difference where we applied either fungicide. Really wasn't that much difference between the fungicides necessarily in yield and versus where we didn't. And that's what this field looked like. Here was the top of the canopy at Lonoke. There's that Septoria way up at the top there. And it was actually a surprise to me because we've often thought of Septoria brown spot as not being yield limiting, right? I'm going to say that a couple of times probably in this talk, but it's not yield limiting. We see it in every field that we walk into around the state in Arkansas. I'm sure many fields in Tennessee, if not all, you see it in those fields in Tennessee. But for the most part, it's low in the canopy and it's not climbing up. What we've seen in these last 2 years in 2020 and 2021 is that when it gets in the top of the canopy earlier in the season, it can become yield limiting. And that's why we're seeing these differences in the fungicide applied plots in these locations versus plots that did not have fungicide. So this is 2021 reinforcing the findings from 2020 where we had Revitec and Miravis top, misprint there, should be Miravis top, not just Miravis. But there was Septoria brown spot in that trial at Arkansas County. And we rated this a little different on a 0 to 9 scale rather than a percentage, but you can see there's about 6 bushels yield between the Miravis top and the non-treated, and about 4 bushels of yield difference in the Revitech and the non-treated, and a little bit of difference in the Miravis and the Revitech there. And in Prairie County, not nearly as much Septoria, but a little bit of target spot there, and significant difference, but only about 2 bushels. So given price, maybe making some money in some years, like this year, we expect prices to be up, but maybe breaking even in others. I generally consider a break even about 2 bushels. So right on the edge there. But again, to reiterate just the fungicide data portion of this talk and reiterate that take home there is that we found that Septoria brown spot was yield limiting. Now, if I want to reinforce that we have a disease that maybe has been thought to not be yield limiting, but all of a sudden I'm showing data that it is, I can show you some pictures I took with my phone. I can show you bar charts, or I can show you tables. But if I can show you a picture of the field, I think then that goes farther in demonstrating that this was an actual problem, and that this was not just maturity. It wasn't just the beans cutting out early, let's say in a field that you didn't necessarily have those controllers treatment strips in. There was actually something going on here. So let's talk about drones real quick to introduce that for those of you that aren't aware. But drones, I think a lot of people know what drones are. Maybe you're not aware of how to operate them is the better way to say it. But I think many of you are becoming familiar with them. This is an older drone, an Inspire 1 that I have a couple of these in my labs. They're inexpensive to buy now, and they fly great, and they carry a lot of payload. So I like to use them. I have some other ones, but typically what I do is I mount something called a multispectral sensor, which is an example of that is this MicaSense Red Edge here, and it collects data in 5 different bands, discrete bands, red, green, blue, red edge, and near infrared. And we use those data, we put the red and the near infrared data together, those bands together, and do a calculation of all those pixels when we put them together. And we can get multiple vegetation indices. Today, we're going to talk about NDVI, which a lot of you have heard of, but that's how we get a vegetation index, is with those doing pixel calculations, or calculations within the pixel, I should say, to calculate a vegetation index from near infrared or red. And for other vegetation indices, you might use other combinations of bands to get those. Now, we fly that drone up in the air about 380 feet, 400 feet is as high as we can fly by FAA regulation. And we just fly across the field and with an overlap of the images we're capturing. So as we're flying across the field, it's snapping images. And we're in this particular field, this is Lone Oak, that Lone Oak County field. This is the actual field that had the Septoria in 2020. We're flying at an 80% front overlap and an 80% side overlap on a bearing of 81 degrees, which is this direction across the field, flying here. And so that means that we're snapping pictures that are actually overlapping each other, and there'll be a computer program we use, Pix4D is what I like to use, that will that the algorithm will look for differences in pixels and the overlap and stitch those together. And so that will create a single image, which we're about to look at, called an orthomosaic. Very quickly, this is drone deploy that we're using to operate. If you're interested in operating a drone, there's also DJI Pilot, there's DJI Pilot 2, there's DJI Go. There's some other apps that you can use on a smartphone to operate a drone and create an orthomosaic. And Pix4D Capture is another one. These are all free, and you can use them with DJI drones and even some other brand drones to fly and collect data. The drone is a tripod. The sensor is really what's important. And the way you operate that drone is important. But essentially, the drone takes off, flies its route, and comes back and lands after taking the images. So a fairly simple process, really. So here really quick, what is an NDVI? Well, an NDVI is vegetation index. As I said before, it stands for normalized difference vegetation index. Here's an example of an NDVI in a fungicide trial that we did in 2017 down in Ashley County. This is what the NDVI looked like when we sprayed it. This is what the NDVI looked like at R6. And you can see where we sprayed 3 different fungicides in a non-treated, replicated 3 times. We had a lot of disease. The fungicide protected yield and plant health. We saw about a 12 bushel yield difference where we had some pretty severe soybean rust and Cercospora leaf blight. So the NDVI is actually calculated as the ratio of near infrared minus red over the sum of near infrared plus red. And so that's because green plants reflect more near infrared, brown plants reflect less near infrared and more red. So the higher the near infrared value, essentially the greener the plant and subsequently the healthier the plant. So here's what that image looked like from Lone Oak County in 2020. Now, this is the field that surprised me early on. This is the one where I was scratching my head thinking the only thing I rated in that field was Septoria brown spot, and there was a 9 bushel yield difference. Well, when I processed the imagery and I went and looked back, this is, if we look now, this field had a little bit of, had some drought stress on the edges. There was some irrigation inconsistencies there, but for the most part, you can see my fungicide strips, and here's the plot map over here to the right. But this is an untreated strip, control. This is an untreated strip, a control. And over here on the far right, untreated strip. But you can see those fungicide strips as darker blue and green, showing that there was healthier plants when I rated it at R6. They weren't mature yet, but in those non-treated strips, they were brown and defoliating. And it kind of, you know, if you didn't know that you were looking at Septoria in the top of the canopy, you might think that that was maturity. Okay, here is Arkansas County in 2021. Again, some significant yield difference here where we had applied fungicide and we had a lot of Septoria here. And you can see these 3 untreated strips. Now this strip over here was created because we sprayed out the remnants of the tank on the edge, but you can see those pink are the non-treated, the green are the Miravis, and the blue is the Revitec. And you can see those treatment strips here, 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 and a non-treated, a non-treated, and a non-treated. And so that tells us, it reinforces that, hey, we had some efficacy here. We had some, you know, we had some beans in the treatment strip that were cutting out a little bit early. They were defoliating a little earlier than they should. Why is that? Well, we ground truthed that by rating those plots. You didn't have to rate the plots. You could have just walked out there and looked, and through, you know, some good sound disease diagnostics there, some process there, you could have seen that there was Septoria brown spot all the way to the top of the canopy, causing some defoliation and subsequent yield loss. And then lastly, this is Prairie County in 2021. There was a little bit of yield difference here. And I chose this one to show because I wanted to show that, you know, when there's not a yield difference, typically we don't see any of these strips like we've seen in the other fields. So here in Prairie County, we've got, you know, an orthomosaic. We have a map, a field map, an NDVI of that trial at R6. But it's really hard to pick out the strips. You can a little bit right here. You can see kind of a linear pattern going across that field in one of the untreated. But for the most part, there wasn't much yield difference here where we applied fungicide, where we didn't. There was Septoria, there was target spot way up at the top, but it wasn't necessarily yield limiting. Again, we barely had a few bushels of yield difference there. You know, some years we would be over that break-even point, some years not so much. But the point here in the take home is that that NDVI value reinforces what kind of efficacy we're seeing with the fungicide application and the fungicide test. So to sum up, I think there's an opportunity for folks doing trial work, on-farm demos, be a county agent or a retailer, or if you're a farmer testing, and you know, the imagery with the ground truthing and with the yield data that we're collecting, I think it tells a good story about that trial, and the imagery kind of ties everything together, in my opinion. So I think this is a good example of how aerial imagery enhances it enhances the story that we tell from whatever the results of the trial are. So with that, I'd like to thank, first and foremost, I'd like to thank University of Tennessee and the folks here for asking me to come over and give this talk. So I greatly appreciate the opportunity to share this research. I want to thank my institution, which is the University of Arkansas System Division of Agriculture and Cooperative Extension Service. They're very supportive of the research and the extension work that my laboratory does. And certainly the Arkansas Soybean Promotion Board. The data and the results that we talked about in this talk today are from a project funded by them. And so they've been very generous in funding my program and working with me to help the growers of the state of Arkansas manage diseases of soybean much better. I'd also like to thank a long list of agents that I have listed here. I can't read out all the names, but anyway, they do a wonderful job helping me with these trials in their counties. And so the agents that I cooperate with are invaluable, and I thank them. And lastly, and certainly not least, is all the folks in my laboratory over the last 2 years that have worked on these trials and help get them sprayed and collect data and mark. And so very thankful for their efforts.